Okay, class. This is for Westciv 2 Spring 2015. I told you guys that I'd finish up with the lecture on the Industrial Revolution, and then we will talk about the ideologies that come out of the Industrial Revolution. Last class, we just got started to talk about the introduction of mass production. Eli Whitney, an American inventor, as I think I mentioned, he was the fellow who came up with the cotton gin back in about the mid-1790s. Around 1800, Eli Whitney, who was a gunsmith, got a contract with the U.S. military. Now, how he got this contract is very important because up until this time, items that were complex, such as clocks, firearms, even wagons, your shoes, were built by craftsmen. And how craftsmen worked is that they worked according to a craft doctrine. The craft doctrine was, well, you knew how to make an item from start to finish, from raw material all the way up to finished product. So a gunsmith, for example, a skilled gunsmith, could make a firearm from scratch, from the barrel to the lock mechanism to the stock to all the small parts, the trigger mechanism. They could do it all. The problem with craft production is that these items, while very similar because they're made by the same people, are not interchangeable. Well, Eli Whitney's innovation was to take those journeymen and apprentices that worked for him, because he was a master gun maker, to take them and separate them so that a few would make just the barrels, a few would just make the stocks, a few would just make the trigger mechanism, and so on and so forth. And so what you get is individuals who are specializing in making just one item. And in making just that one item, they had to make sure that that item would work, with minor hand fitting originally, with any of the other parts that the other groups working under Whitney made. And so when Whitney approaches the Army, he has only about 9 or 10 rifles. The Army's Springfield Armory in Springfield, Massachusetts would make that many in just a couple of hours of work. So mass production was not quantity production, but it was interchangeable production. I should say Eli Whitney's contribution to mass production. Because what impressed the Army and what got Whitney the gun contract was the fact that he told his subordinates, take the guns apart, mix them up, put them back together again. And out of the 9 guns, let's say there's 9 guns, 7 or 8 of them worked. And of course this impressed the U.S. military greatly, because having interchangeable parts, especially on the battlefield, it would be a major advantage. Now, the problem with Whitney's form of mass production was that you still had individuals literally sitting there making individual parts themselves, hand filing them. At the end of the 19th century, so the end of the 1800s, starting around 1880, the Germans are going to contribute to mass production by coming up with the idea of the gauge. In mass production, you have simple gauges called go and no-go gauges. So I'm actually working on some World War II radio equipment here, so let me just pull something up really fast. I'm making, say, this part right here. This is the tuning wheel of a old Philco radio. If I was making this by hand, even though this is made out of cast Bakelite plastic, but if I was making this out of metal, the diameter here, I would have a gauge that was the size of this wheel. And if it fit down in that gauge, that is the go gauge. However, they don't want you to make it too small, so you have what is called a no-go gauge. And the no-go gauge, it should not go over the part. If it goes over the part, then you've made the part too small and it's junk. Throw it away. So if it fits in the go gauge, you've made it small enough. If it doesn't go on if it goes in the no-go gauge, you've made it too small. And you have these gauges for every aspect. This direction, the hole in the middle right here. You have gauges for every aspect of a part made. And what this allows is it allows relatively unskilled laborers to make parts, because the skill is no longer in the craftsman's mind. Well, it's not even a craftsman, the worker's mind. It's now in the form of those gauges. Because before, a skilled craftsman had to be able to sort of eyeball it. A skilled craftsman had to feel with his hands and know when the part was just right. A skilled craftsman knew how to put the parts together and make it all work. With gauges and standardized parts, you don't need to have that knowledge. You do not need to have that craft. And what this does is it de-skills workers. Now, the final piece of mass production that would make mass production was the introduction of the assembly line by Henry Ford in 1913. Ford did not just come up with the assembly line on his own. Before Ford started making cars, other industries used a form of assembly line production, but it's better described as disassembly line production. Gustavus Swift in Chicago pioneered modern meat packing, in that cars or cattle would enter a meat packing house on one side, be killed, be slaughtered, be disassembled, not by skilled butchers who knew how to disassemble an entire side of beef, but individuals trained to do one operation and one operation only, the same way that Whitney set up his workers to do one thing, make one part, and one part only. What is the benefit of only having individuals know how to do one operation, make one part, or in the case of Swift, take one piece of meat off of a side of beef as it comes down this disassembly line? You don't have to pay them as much. That is the beauty of mass production. That's why stuff is cheaper when it's mass produced, because craftsmen demand higher prices. You're paying for their knowledge and their skill. Unskilled workers doing one operation, you're not having to pay them as much. You're not having to pay them, in a lot of cases, 1/10 of what a skilled craftsman would make. And so Henry Ford in 1913 took the idea that Gustavus Swift had and just reversed it. Instead of disassembling cattle, he assembled cars, starting out with the frame, having one operation done at each stage along the assembly line. So you had relatively unskilled workers putting these cars together. So a person might be, the guy at the end of the assembly line that all they do is they put wheels on the right side of the car because there's another guy on the left side putting wheels on. That's all they do. They don't even put the lug nuts on. All they do is put the wheel on there. Somebody else right next to them puts the lug nuts on and secures the wheel. You don't have to know how to build the car from start to finish. All you have to be is trained like a monkey to put that wheel on. And so what you get is the rise of the factory. Because instead of small craft shops, you have to afford to buy and maintain the machines that now make the parts. Because one of the things that comes about because of the invention of gauges and mechanical machines, so-called machine tools, are machines that stamp out the part. So instead of an individual with a hand file making a part, you have machines stamping the part out, and all the worker is doing is pulling a lever. Just like in textiles that we talked about, the invention of the power loom, meaning that now you have a powered loom that can make lengths of cloth that are vastly wider than any man-powered loom could make. Now you have machines stamping out parts at a relatively fast pace, with the gauges now built into them by the turn of the last century. So it's not that you stamp the part out and you now have to gauge them. The tool itself, the machine itself that you operate, has the gauges built into it so that the tool, when it makes the part, is gauging it at the same time. And so what this does is you have these factories whereupon you need a lot of machines to make all of these individual parts. Instead of one man making all the parts with a relatively rudimentary set of tools, you have complex machines that are making individual parts, helping to put together the components. This means that you need to centralize labor. You need to centralize the location. And this type of production strongly favors the division, what becomes known as the division of labor, meaning that I'm now the person who only makes this part right here. Somebody else makes this part right here. Somebody else puts these parts together. This is the division of labor and the specialization of labor. It destroys the craft tradition, where a single worker did the entire job. Instead, in the factory system, one worker performed one task, and you had an army of workers performing all the tasks, so that in total you're making the product, but no one worker is doing all of the task. Originally, as this form of production evolves, skilled workers become the managers, the technicians. However, over time, you will have a professional management class arise that are not skilled craftsmen, but instead skilled in the management and administration of the factory. And as you see the growth of factories, you see the growth of the so-called factory town. If any of you live in the city of Alcoa, you live in what used to be a factory town, because the Aluminum Company of America came to East Tennessee, just outside of Maryville, because before the Aluminum Company there was no town of Alcoa. Alcoa stands for Aluminum Company of America. Alcoa came, I believe, in 1908 or somewhere between 1908 and 1912, and built the West Plant, the very first plant. The West Plant is no longer there. Alcoa is actually building their new high school on the plant location, which I find very surprising, since the West Plant was a polluted Superfund site. That aside, Alcoa is a perfect example of the factory town. Why did they come to East Tennessee? They came to East Tennessee excuse me. They came to East Tennessee for cheap labor, to tap into the labor supply here in this area. They also came to East Tennessee to tap in to energy. Calderwood Dam, well before TVA dammed up Fort Loudon and Tellico, Calderwood Dam was dammed up by Alcoa itself to create a lake to power the West Plant. So where factory towns arise is either where they have access to power or labor or both. Now, of course, access to labor would mean building it in established cities. And many times they did build the factories in established towns like New York City, Chicago, and places like that. However, in other places, they built them where they could find power. So they built the towns from scratch. And so you have these factory towns that are built, maintained, and in many cases governed by the factory owners themselves, the companies. Alcoa owned the city of Alcoa up until, I believe, the late 1920s or early 1930s. So the city of Alcoa did not exist before then. The city of Alcoa as a population center was the owned property of the Aluminum Company of America. And of course, as factory towns boomed, not just one class emerges, a new class or a new set of classes emerge. The first of these classes is the working class. The working class, as we know it today, is a class of unskilled labor at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder. These are poor, normally immigrants into the towns, sometimes immigrants into the country. Like, for example, the United States would experience a vast number of immigration from Europe during the late 1800s and early 1900s. And many of these immigrants would wind up in New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago, and other towns as the factory workers. Now, factory life requires a whole new set of values that farmers and traditional workers did not originally live by. Since you're making one part, and the guy next to you is making one part, you need to have the productive process timed so that these parts come together in a timely fashion so that the person putting them together never runs out of one part, so that the assembly line always operates smoothly. So factory labor requires strict discipline, a fast pace, and close supervision by a management class. Time. What we consider, something as common as time. Of course, today, time is regulated by many people by your iPhone, the clock on it. But the fact of the matter is that before the Industrial Revolution, many Americans, I would say most Americans, most people in the West, did not live by time. They did not wear a watch. Farmers didn't. They lived by the sun. When the sun came up, they went to work. When the sun was at its height, they went to lunch. And when, of course, the sun went down, they knocked it off for the day. The same is true of the craftsmen. Craftsmen who built clocks and whatever worked at their own pace. Many times, craftsmen would finish a project early and just knock off an hour or so early. However, in the factory, you worked from the 8 o'clock until sometimes 5 o'clock at night or later. Early factory labor was rigorous, 6 days a week, sometimes 10, sometimes 12 hours a day. This work was monotonous. I mean, if all you're doing is making this part right here all day, 6 days a week, 52 weeks a year, this gets really monotonous. And of course, monotony leads to, lapses in judgment and concentration. This leads to people becoming injured. And this is amplified by the fact that, these early factories and the machines that they contained were incredibly dangerous. As you can see right here in this top picture, we have children working a power loom. This is a power loom right here. Actually, no, I take that back. That is not a power loom. This right here is a mule. As you can see, it is spooling thread. And the children, the reason why they were employed working either the looms or these thread machines is that they had small fingers. They could fit into the machines and tie up a thread that may have broken. Of course, they might also have their fingers taken off by whirling belts here and dangerous pieces of metal. Likewise, you can see a machine shop, this woodcut of a machine shop of the late 1800s. Massive wheels, massive machines, all of which could be dangerous or even deadly to the workers that use them. And so, being unskilled, no longer having the craft to know how to make the product from start to finish, the working class becomes completely dependent on the factory owners for their livelihood, because they're no longer the owners of the products of their labor. The only thing that they are paid for is their time. They are not paid for what they produce. They are paid for how much time they spend producing it. A craftsman owns his tools. A craftsman owns the clock that he's making, and of course he sells it. However, these workers are paid, well, they may be paid by the products that they produce, but what's the value of this right here if that's all I produce, this wheel? I don't even own the tools that I use, like these machines. I am just basically paid to show up to work and produce a small amount of stuff. So what is the social impact of industrialization? Well, you see the splintering of the extended family. Farmers and traditional families, you see several generations oftentimes living either in close proximity and sometimes even in the same household. You see, say, parents and their children, of course, living in a house, and you see the parents living either down the road or sometimes in the same farmhouse as well. However, as people move into the cities, they move away from their families. They move to where the labor is at. Likewise, farm families are quite large, because farm families benefit from having more than just one or two kids. It's cheap labor. It's free labor. However, families do not benefit from large families in the cities. They are cost. This is why early on, parents sent their kids to work in factories so that their children could make money for the family. And so, especially after the outlaw of child labor in the West in the early 1900s, you see the shrinking of the urban family, because if children cannot earn a paycheck for the family, all they are is a mouth to feed. And thus, this is one reason why urban families are smaller than rural families. You also see larger populations moving into the cities, creating vast amounts of pollution. You see in New York City and Boston, these are cities that up until the early 1900s, you could still find outhouses in the downtown areas. Well, you need sewer systems, you need water systems, because the vast numbers of people and the refuse and well, the crap that they produce needs to be done away with. On top of the pollution that is naturally created, you see the immense pollution, as you can see in this first picture here, of the factories themselves. Charles Dickens. Many of you have either watched or even read A Christmas Carol or some of his other works like A Tale of Two Cities. Dickens characterizes his late 18th century London in a very dark overtones. And there's a reason why Dickens paints this dark, foreboding picture, because London was dark. From all accounts, London was continually dark, shrouded in a haze of coal smoke and pollution created by the factories in the surrounding areas. You also see an explosion in crime in these early urban centers, because many of the immigrants coming in to work in the factories are single men. Single men, of course, need companionship, so you see a growth in prostitution. The poor, regardless of their gender, oftentimes escape into vices like drinking and gambling. And of course, since many times drinking and gambling are not legal in these cities, or even if they are legal, legitimate agents do not get involved in gambling or alcohol. This is left up to criminal elements. And so you see the birth of organized crime because of this. And with the birth of modern gangs, as they fight over territory, as people become violent just from living in close proximity with each other, you see the rise in domestic abuse, violence, criminal violence, and the like. The combination of pollution, the need for civil services, the rise in crime, leads to what today we call urban planning. We can't think of a large city today that does not have a police force, but before, approximately, I think it's the 1880s, New York City did not have a professional police force. Police forces are created because of the rise of crime and other problems created by the population explosion due to the Industrial Revolution. It is also this explosion in population, especially the density of the population, that creates, of course, the need for civil services, such as fire departments, water departments, subways, and things like that. And, of course, this gives rise to urban planning in the form of city and local governments. And then finally, the growth of the modern industrial city gives rise to a professional class. As I said before, early on, factory floor managers, shop managers, had been the craftsmen of old. However, as that first generation of management dies out, the new class of management are professional managers trained in the factory form of production, but not necessarily the craft. These managers do not know how to actually perform the operation themselves. They just know how to manage those that do perform the operations. This is white-collar management. People who are skilled in either technical skills, such as engineering, management skills such as business, accounting skills, accountants, and even outside the factories. As people now work 10 to 12-hour days, they can't farm, so they're relying upon professional grocers. With population density and the disease that brings, you see the rise in the need for physicians and doctors. So our professional world that we live in, where people grow up, graduate from high school, go to college, and get a degree to be a teacher, to be a doctor, to be a nurse, to be an engineer. This is relatively new, and it is also a product of the Industrial Revolution. Now let's talk about the two classes in greater detail and how this new middle class management class and the working class not only interrelate with each other, but also how they affect Western culture overall. Because in the late 1800s and early 1900s, you see the middle class having a great impact on how society is constructed. The middle class, as it becomes known, literally reshapes society in its own image. Because it's the middle class that, while they are not as large as the working class, they have discretionary income. While not as rich as the upper class, the factory owners, they have some discretionary income, but they are large enough that the collective spending of the middle class outweighs that of the upper class, because it's relatively small, or the working class. They're large but poor. Now, the middle class, this is the professional management, the professional white-collar class of the Industrial Revolution. Usually, not all the time, but usually, the middle class makes enough money so that only the husband has to work. The man is the only one that has to work. His job pays enough. This means that while the women oftentimes have part-time jobs, or they may work at charity events or things like that outside the home. Their primary focus is in the home. And so what you see, because of this division between male and female spheres, is you see a division between men and women. Men are seen as the breadwinner, the person who brings home the bacon. Men are supposed to go forth and, as they put it, do battle in the urban jungle to allow the family to survive. On the other hand, the woman is supposed to stay at home. The woman is supposed to maintain the sanctuary of peace and tranquility so that the man can return from this hectic day of business or on the factory floor, can relax. Because at the core of the middle class dream is to have their own semi-independence. The working class, by contrast, is heavily dependent upon the cities that they live in, the factories in which they work. The middle class, on the other hand, while dependent upon the paycheck that they earn, their discretionary income, that extra income that is above what they need to merely survive upon, allows them a level of independence that the working class does not have. They are able to buy a private home. This is the centerpiece of the middle class dream. And so this becomes the focal point of both the men's and women's spheres. The men's purpose is to financially support the home, to bring home the bacon. The women's purpose in their sphere is to maintain the home, to act as the manager of it. Now, by contrast, the working class does not make enough, and thus both sexes have to work. This is why working class men and women work in factories. It just depends on what industry that they work in. Men tending to work in heavy industry and manufacturing, whereas women tend to work in textiles and those types of industries. Instead of having a private home, the working class lives in crowded working class neighborhoods, like you see this woodcut of a working class neighborhood in London. This is actually the backside of what are commonly called row houses, because they're built right next to each other in a row, oftentimes right connected to each other. As you can see, each of these row houses has their own little backyard. Initially, this backyard was necessary because, as you can tell right here, they have their own outhouse. But these row houses also are necessary for doing laundry and doing things that, of course, modern conveniences that we have today make unnecessary. The public nature of these row houses is illustrated by the fact that in many Western European cities and American cities, even these individual homes had multiple families living in them. If you go to Philadelphia or New York, you can find these 3- and 4-story brick row houses that are now single-family homes. But originally, you had a family living on each individual floor. So, while the middle class prided itself on its privacy, while it cherished its privacy, the working class had no such luxury, because you shared kitchens, you shared bathroom facilities. Your life was incredibly public. Your children, well, they played in the street out front. If you had all of these people and there is no form of privacy, this will give rise to working class culture, in that when men get off work, they oftentimes do not travel back home like the middle class management worker would. You know, the white collar professional aim to get off work, come home from work, because they got to enjoy their home. The working class worker, however, the home was merely a bed to sleep in most of the time. So for the working class, many times they would not immediately go home after work, and instead they would stop by local clubs, local bars, Working class culture, in contrast to the middle class culture, was focused on the public arena. The working class was based on, or working class culture was based on sort of this communal living, not only in the home, but in the neighborhood. This is why working class neighborhoods seem to have sort of a life unto themselves, whereas middle class neighborhoods, while neighbors are friendly with each other, they are more self-contained on the property of the individual homeowner. This is a big difference between the two classes. Now, what are the positive effects of industrialization? Well, number one, more stuff, cheaper price. Mass production allows for the production of widgets like this. And if you guys are wondering what this actually goes to, it's not complete because I've not got it. This is an old 1946 tube radio case. The radio is sitting behind my computer right now. Greater productivity, because that radio right there, you can find them on eBay, and they look just alike on eBay. They are mass-produced, identical copies of each other. You see increased wealth, especially for those people able to find a niche inside the inside whatever industry that they're in. So, for example, Andrew Carnegie, a man who came over here as a poor, almost orphan from Scotland, would work his way up through the ranks of first the railroad industry and then the iron smelting industry, and then he would find his niche by finding a way to make steel cheap. He would capitalize upon that Kelly-Bessemer process that we talked about and, well, become the second richest man in America by the time that he retired. You see the breakdown of old limitations and taboos. Instead of craftsmen guarding their craft, now the knowledge of how to produce stuff is made more public. It's in manuals, it's in protocols, it's in procedures. And while before it was the craftsmen who were the skilled class, after the Industrial Revolution, it is the middle class who knows how to manage this knowledge rather than actually use it that becomes the dominant class. We also see the birth of nuclear families. Most of us, like for example, my family is a classic nuclear family. Nuclear meaning that it's the core, meaning two parents and usually only 2 or 3 kids. My family is, of course, my mom, my dad, and me and my brother, and that's it. Most of us today come from those type of families. Whereas my mother's father, for example, was one of 12 children because he grew up on a farm here in East Tennessee, out in the country. And then finally, a positive effect of industrialization was the need for an educated society. Now this, I should clarify this. This does not necessarily mean that all education is equal, because some are educated, even today, to manage society, to manage the productive process, to be highly skilled individuals like doctors or engineers. Others are educated, I would say the better term is trained, to work in factories. But you still need to have some type of knowledge and be able to pass that knowledge on. So yes, one of the positive effects of the Industrial Revolution is the need for education. Counterbalancing the positive effects of industrialization are the negative effects. The craft class was a highly skilled, proud class. These are individuals that prided themselves in their knowledge on how to build guns or clocks or wagons or shoes or whatever. With the de-skilling of labor, that class is pretty much destroyed. You still see some master craftsmen when it comes to carpentry, for example, but no longer. I mean, think about this. How many of you have family heirlooms in your family? For example, furniture. Furniture that is beautifully crafted, one of a kind. Now think about that. That is considered a valuable family heirloom. Whereas most people, the furniture in their house is mass-produced. Even quality furniture is identical to other units that came off the line at the same time. And for those of us who know how college students live, I'm pretty sure most of you have one of these, or maybe more than one, a piece of furniture that's made out of particle board pressed together. That is like the epitome of mass-produced furniture. You also see that with the de-skilling of labor, you see, of course, the increasing use of unskilled labor. Unskilled labor, by its definition, cannot ask as much in terms of wages than the craftsman can. So these are, by definition again, poor people who make poor wages. And they work in dangerous and tightly controlled environments. This is one reason why early on you have violence between labor and management. This is why labor unions are founded in the first place, because it's this tension between those that want to rigidly control the productive process in order to maximize production, and those that are at the short end of the stick of that control. Well, they don't see eye to eye. We also see wealth disparity. We've also often heard of the robber barons of the late 1800s, the 1880s and 1890s. These are men and women who profited greatly from the Industrial Revolution. And we also know about the vast armies of those people who did not. And then, of course, increased urban populations led to the modern urban problems that we have today. Environmental pollution, crime, drug use, urban decay. So the actual evolution of the cities are a nail in their own coffin in some ways. Now, one thing that you need to understand is that while the Industrial Revolution is often seen as a purely civil affair, just an economic evolution, there is a force pushing the Industrial Revolution. And then, of course, this is the militaries of the world. Most importantly, the British Royal Navy. Because one reason why the British are at the forefront of the textile Industrial Revolution is that before the Industrial Revolution, the British were the world's premier naval power. And as the world's premier naval power, they are in constant demand of canvas. Before the Industrial Revolution, sails or ships were powered by wind power, meaning that they needed large canvas sails. Having the largest navy in the West, if not the world, the British Royal Navy was a major consumer of canvas, which of course meant that British textile mills profited from that customer, and that profit, that demand, gave incentive for the industrialization of Great Britain. Now, as textiles give way to steel and the Second Industrial Revolution, you see the militaries of the world again pushing this Industrial Revolution forward. Because by the late 1800s, most Western industrialized nations have modern navies. Here we see a picture of the Great White Fleet. This is the U.S. Navy circa 1890s. The United States by the 1890s was an industrial giant. It had superseded Great Britain. It was the most powerful industrial economy in the world. As powerful industrial countries, the governments of these countries wanted to showcase that power. And thus, they wanted to have the most technologically advanced militaries of their age. And at the time, the most technologically advanced weapon out there was the warship, the early battleship. And so, these navies, the United States, Great Britain, France, and Germany, other countries like Italy and even South American countries to a lesser degree, wanted to showcase their power. Not just military power, but economic power. They will invest heavily in these coal-burning steel ships, and thus to have, of course, the steel ships in the first place, they need to have the steel industry. So it's kind of like a self-feeding process. You want a large navy to showcase your industrial might, so you must have that industrial might in the first place. So the steel industry will benefit from the constant demand from shipbuilders. And of course, this gives incentive for the expansion of steel, especially in Germany and the United States. Of course, these ships have to move. They have to be powered by steam engines. And of course, thus coal becomes the principal fuel, at least up until the late 19-teens, early 1920s. Coal, of course, is, well, concentrated mainly in the United States, Great Britain, Europe, and in China. So if you're going to sail all over the world, you need to have what are known as coaling stations. And coaling stations, well, they need to be protected. They need to have facilities more than just a place in order to refuel. So these coaling stations become naval bases with dry docks and harbors for these navies, not just the military navies, but the ever-growing merchant marines of steam-powered cargo ships and passenger liners. As I said, these investments need to be protected. So this military connection to the Industrial Revolution will not only further the Industrial Revolution, but as the online lecture on imperialism talks about, it is these far-flung bases that also give incentives for imperialism. Now, I'm going to take a break really quick here and get this lecture uploaded so that you guys have access to it. But if you don't see it already when you're watching this, look for a lecture on the ideological effects of the Industrial Revolution. It's not just economics and politics that are affected by the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution changes how people think society should actually be structured. And that's this next lecture will talk about that. So let me end right now and get this uploaded, and I will hopefully see you not only in class but here in just a minute once I get that lecture made. Thank you very much.